So let's get this question out of the way first. Why am I sat in front of an easel when we're going to be talking about a murderer? And the answer to that is very simple, because today's murderer was an artist. So I figured if we're going to talk about a chap who was particularly good at killing, but also good at drawing things, why don't we draw him? So today we are talking about Richard Dadd, an infamous English painter who was famous for his portrayals, his very, very detailed portrayals of fairies and mad worlds with intricate details and lots of characters and lots of stuff happening. And his artworks were very influential, probably because they looked absolutely nuts. And you could kind of tell that the person who painted them probably had some complicated stuff going on up here. And we will get into that complicated stuff in just a sec. But first things first, here is the picture of Richard Dadd that we're going to be using as reference. I like this one. I mean, it's one of the only pictures of Richard Dadd I was able to find, and he looks particularly mad in it. I'm pretty sure this picture was taken after everything happened. So he does look like he's away with the fairies. There is nothing going on in those eyes. We are going to draw him in charcoal while we talk, and then maybe we'll add a few mystical elements to it at the end. The kind of thing that Dadd himself would probably appreciate. All right, let's get started. And just to start, we're going to start with some of the outline and some of the darker areas here. So we're using my charcoal pencils to start this, just for those really dark areas of shadow. And then once we've got that shadow in, we can build out from there and start adding some texture and detail. Richard Dadd was born in Chatham, and it wasn't long before his talents for art were noticed, and it was noted that he was a particularly gifted artist. And what helped with that was the fact that his dad, who was in the early 1800s, who was a particularly successful apothecary or chemist on Chatham High Street, but he clearly wasn't satisfied with that and had a bit of a creative flair himself. And so he really encouraged Richard and was part of the driving force behind his artistic abilities. And he really encouraged him to stick to it. And actually, his dad was encouraged so much by his son's own artistic flair that he himself kind of switched careers. He wanted to become a gilder and a carver and started doing that instead of his chemistry work. Now, his dad was so supportive and helped by his successful business in that Richard attended Rochester Grammar School, and all the while he was at Rochester Grammar School, his dad was basically paying for art lessons, extra art lessons outside of school. And then once his time at school came to an end, he started to help out by paying school fees at the Royal Academy School of Art for Richard. So he was really setting him up for a future successful career as an artist. Now, this might look a bit rubbish at the moment and a bit like I'm just scribbling. But the good thing about charcoal is it spreads really well. So you can lay down some rough shadow like this, and then once you've done that, you can literally take a finger and blend it all in. Get that nice and consistent. Whenever I'm working with charcoal, I always end up with horribly, horribly dirty hands because I end up going in and messing with it. That's what I like. I like that you can use your hands, you can actually get involved and, you can touch the medium. Just work out what I'm looking at. And interestingly, it was at the Royal Academy. I'm just going to switch pens here. Let's do some sharpening. It was at the Royal Academy School of Art where his teachers obviously noticed his technical and artistic ability and how good he was at drawing stuff. But they also noted his kind and gentle nature. Grom. Oh, now. No. No. Which is interesting given everything that was to come. If you're enjoying this so far and you'd like to see more of this kind of thing, then like and subscribe. That'll really help me out, and that will encourage me to make more of these kinds of videos. All right, back to Richard. Really just getting that shadowing detail in there to begin with. Once I've marked out all the shadow, it kind of gives me a better idea where everything's going to sit. Now, after art school, Richard's career took off much as everybody expected. He started getting lots of commissions, and he was invited to take part in lots of exhibitions of his early work. Looked like there was a long and promising career ahead of a very talented young artist. And all of this success and promise for the future made both Richard and his dad, who had been so supportive of him, very, very happy. Which is why what was going to happen in the years that followed was all the more unusual and surprising. It was around July 1842 that Richard was invited by his wealthy patron. See, most artists need somebody to pay for all the work they're doing, otherwise it's not a particularly lucrative career. He was invited by his wealthy patron, a man named Sir Thomas Phillips, on a grand tour, which was something of a mini world tour designed to inspire the artists to create more great works. And they visited all of the great classical sites, visiting the Parthenon, the pyramids, all of these great places. They travelled all the way through France, Greece, Italy, and covered the Middle East. And this was all well and good, and it inspired many fantastic paintings from Richard Dad and the other artists who were attending this tour. But it was also one hell of a lot of work. It was in the 1800s, doing this amount of travelling when you are essentially just an artist who's used to sitting in a studio and painting, this was a lot of work. Especially during the Middle Eastern section of the tour, when the heat and the dust and the travel and the sometimes dodgy accommodations they're expected to stay in, and all of this that they just weren't used to, took its toll on them, and especially on Richard Dad. And by the way, it's not lost on me the irony of the fact that this guy is called Richard Dad, and his story really heavily rotates around what he did to his dad. Sorry, sometimes this can be an irritatingly squeaky easel. Well, hey, if I get really successful at this, people want me to do more, then maybe I'll be able to afford a slightly better one. Yeah, sorry, that's awful. Here we go, we'll keep this light here. Save your ears, and then come in for some of that darkness around the bottom there. And unfortunately, because of all of the pressures and stresses of travelling, and despite Richard's huge enthusiasm to be there and to be experiencing new things and creating new art, his health actually started to suffer. And he was experiencing almost non-stop headaches, which everybody at first put down to sunstroke. You know, they're in really hot places. That would have made sense. And that would have made sense were it not for the insane delusions that Richard was experiencing at the same time. And these were not the mad ramblings of somebody who's just spent a few days too long in the sun. It was much worse than that. Now, it's not certain whether what followed was a result of his worsening mental state or actually one of the chief causes of it. But when Richard was travelling around Egypt, he was introduced to something that the locals referred to as the Hubble Bubble Pipe. Not 100% sure what was in the Hubble Bubble Pipe, whether this was just some kind of shisha bar that he went to and just had a massive overreaction, or whether it was something worse, something that had a huge irreversible impact on Richard's mental state, on his psychological well-being. One of the bonuses of charcoal is you can kind of keep it a bit loosey-goosey as well, because it's charcoal, it's supposed to be rough. There we go, this is where we get to be slightly more careful with our shadows, because we don't want our really severe shadow to interfere with the face too much, because that's where the important detail is going to be. And I think you can start to see some shape coming in there. So, at first, Richard claimed to be hearing strange noises in the bubbles, and that started as just, the bubbles in the pipe. But then those slowly turned into voices delivering messages to him. And it wasn't just any old voices that were speaking to good old Richard during his Egyptian holiday. It was actually the ancient Egyptian god Osiris who was talking to him and delivering him messages and revealing secrets about the world to him. And Richard actually, please try and ignore the fact that I'm just smudging everything. What I tend to do is I smudge everything as I'm going, and then I try and turn it into something that looks all right at the end. So we'll see if I can do that again here. Yes, so it was the ancient god Osiris speaking to him. And this didn't finish when he stopped smoking the pipe. In fact, it only got worse. And Osiris kept speaking to him for much of the rest of his life. And he believed that he had been chosen by this god as his messenger, his tool that had been placed on earth. All right, got to be careful around the face, because we don't want to completely obscure some of the detail here. I'll make Richard proud. That's fine. If it doesn't look anything like him, then I'll just claim that Osiris was nudging my hand all the way through. Now, things drastically deteriorated for Richard, and they left Egypt and headed to Italy, to Rome. And by this point, Richard had decided that Osiris was telling him that he was his tool on earth to oppose the devil, and that the devil could take many forms. And so Richard decided that the devil had in fact taken the form of the Pope. And the Pope happened to be in Rome while Richard attended on his grand tour. And had it not been for the Pope's heavy papal bodyguard, who were present obviously all the time, he would have attempted to assassinate the Pope in Rome. And this probably would have all ended right there when he was immediately stopped and arrested or killed. But he wasn't, he didn't succeed, and so he then attacked his benefactor. Probably because Sir Thomas Phillips had decided that this guy was a lunatic and had had a key role in stopping him from attempting to assassinate the Pope. At which point Richard probably turned around and went, you know what, actually, I think you might be the devil in disguise. Unfortunately, he didn't do any major harm, and before he could continue, he was persuaded that it was probably a good idea to return to London, because this trip was doing him no good whatsoever, and not doing anyone else any good in the meantime. Now, when Richard got back to England, his paintings were in contention to win a prestigious award, the winner of who would have their works of art gracing the Houses of Parliament in England. And when he got back, he had the disappointing news that he had not won the competition. And if he wasn't already in a really vulnerable state of mind, this made things 10 times worse. And all the while, his friends and family, his father, were all telling themselves that this was just a temporary illness. It would pass, and he would get back to being his normal, successful self. But it didn't. It just got worse. And ultimately, it was at this point that it was decided that Richard was a danger to himself and others, and the doctor decided that he needed to be confined. Now, Robert, Richard's father, did not like the idea of this. There was obviously huge stigma around mental asylums and the people that ended up in them. A lot of his hopes were obviously riding on the success of his artist son. And the idea of him ending up in a mental asylum and never being able to get rid of that association was just too much. So he was very reluctant to take this advice. And at the same time, Richard, in one of his more kind of lucid periods, convinced his father that actually, no, all he needed was a break. He just needed to get out of the hustle and bustle of the city and escape to somewhere in the countryside, get away from it all basically, and just be somewhere chill for a while so he could collect himself and collect his thoughts. So his father agreed, and this is when they decided to move to Cobham in Kent, a lovely, quiet little village with rolling fields and plenty of countryside to get lost in. And they figured, okay, where else is better than this for Richard to recover from his illness? Really is very wide-eyed and creepy. It's a shame. I'm sure he had his, when he was lucid and when he was okay, I'm sure he had his moments. So the fact that this is the only picture I've been able to find that exists of him, and he just looks like an absolute psychopath. Then again, he's mad, so it doesn't ultimately matter. Just getting that detail. This is where you got to be a little more careful around here, because these details do need to be correct. Not bad. I've seen better, I've seen worse. Let's add a bit more detail in. Let's add these paintbrushes to be a lot more loosey-goosey with these parts. It's about basically, if you don't want to spend days and days and weeks on a drawing or a painting, it's kind of more about just choosing the priority. What is it you are prioritizing in the image? Do you want it to look like the person? Do you want it to look like an interpretation of the person, so not completely accurate? Or are you going for like photorealism, in which case, you want to cover everything? So elements like this, we're obviously just doing a quick charcoal sketch for this one. Nothing too crazy. So we're keeping it very loosey-goosey. So something like this, something like the easel, doesn't ultimately matter too much, which is why I'm keeping it very loose. It also covers my arse for when something looks shit. I can just claim that that wasn't important. That's not an important element of the picture. So, on the 28th of August 1843, which was only a day or so after it had been recommended that Richard be put in an asylum essentially, they travelled by gig from London to Cobham, him and his father that is. And they arrived at a place called the Ship Inn in Cobham in the early evening. You know what, I think it's time to start smudging. So I am just going to go with my finger for this, not for the detail parts at the top, but for some of this body, I'm just going to go in and start smudging because it is just shadow basically. You can really blend the edges in nicely like this. Get a nice, really nice smooth transition between the dark and the lighter elements. Who needs brushes and pencils ultimately? You just do this all with your finger. And anywhere that there are highlights that I've gone maybe slightly too dark on, I have the option of coming in with either a rubber and just taking off a little bit of that charcoal, or actually using a white charcoal pencil and just adding in a highlight, which we might do at the end. But you don't care about that. You want to find out what's about to happen with Richard Dad and his dad. The waiter at the Ship Inn, who was to turn into one of the key witnesses in this case, recalled that he brought a pot of tea and some cheese and biscuits for them, and that Richard had a, we say, particularly surly manner, and that at a certain point in the evening, Richard decided to go for a walk. He'd invited his father to come with him, but his father had declined, and so Richard disappeared off. Now, the waiter had brought Richard a pint of porter, and upon noticing, after he'd left for his walk, that the porter had not been drunk, he recalled asking Robert, "Doesn't your son like porter?" To which Robert's reply was a weary, "I don't know, I'm sure." And apparently it sounded like the tone of a desperate, weary man who was quite possibly wondering whether he'd made the right choice in not having Richard committed and having him brought to Cobham. Not long after this, the waiter noticed that Richard had returned. And then a little bit later than that, he noticed that both men had gone. Now, it was a lovely summer's evening, perfect evening for a walk, so he was like, yeah, they've probably just gone for that stroll after all. Maybe Robert wasn't as tired as he thought he was. And so he decided to stay up and wait for them to return. But when it got to around midnight and neither of them had reappeared, he got a little concerned. But he went out to the stables and he checked for their gig, and upon seeing that it wasn't there, he decided, they must have come back and decided not to stay at the ship after all, and they've just headed back to London, and he thought no more of it. Now we're just going to use this little stub of paper here, which is very useful at continuing to smudge and blur whilst being able to keep it slightly more detailed than you can with your finger. And it's about now that we switch to my reporter in the field, who is me last week with a beard. So if anyone's particularly confused, it's just me with a lot more hair. So we are in Cobham, or more specifically Cobham Woods, to try and track down a murder scene. I've got my trusty lunatic sniffer dog with me. He is guaranteed to be of no use whatsoever. Yeah, what do I think is the likelihood of being able to track down the exact point the murder took place? Yeah, is 0. But the lane where it happened is kind of still there, so we can have a look and we can take our best guess, which, to be honest, is basically all history is, really. What was that? What was that? What do you want? In hindsight, it's probably a stupid idea bringing the dog. It's kind of a pain in the ass to film with him running around. He's a good boy, though. And here is the Ship Inn, famously where Richard, Dad, and his dad had a final bit of tea before, well, going on a lovely summer's walk together where nothing untoward happened. Now, you can almost guarantee that because I've lived here almost my entire life and have never seen anybody on the footpath that we're about to go down, that today it's going to be really busy. So, seeing as the original Halfpence Lane is basically just a road now, what we're walking on now might as well be the original Halfpence Lane. So, we need to find a chalk pit or just some kind of hole in the ground. Of course, there's loads of shit going on. I don't know what they're doing over there. Okay, I don't know if you can make them out from here, but there is a whole team of people over there. And I don't trust them. Yes, I think they're just planting trees in the countryside. Yes, I think it's a really nice countryside initiative. But they could also be rival murder scene hunters, so don't trust them. Or this is still a hot spot for murder and people are just real blatant about it. Maybe they're all just burying bodies over there. Lovely initiative. Lovely to see that one of England's greatest pastimes hasn't completely disappeared yet. You can still murder your dad in the woods and chuck him in a hole and nobody cares. Also, with the road right next to the footpath, it's not quite as peaceful for murder, should we say. Chances are when Richard Dad was offing his dad, there weren't quite so many fat BMWs powering their way down this road alongside them. Again, a more peaceful time. Dare I say it, a nicer time. Apart from all the killing. Not seeing any murder holes yet. I hope it wasn't actually over there where those people are digging. Oh well. We shall endeavour to keep looking for an ancient chalk pit. Okay, there were some trees back there. It's the closest we've come to a chalk pit. I'm going to walk up to those trees over there, and if I don't see anything that looks like a chalk pit there, then I'm just going to pick that one. We'll do a little spiel there. Okay, this is amazing. I didn't actually know this was here, but there's actually a sign right here pointing at the path that we just walked down, calling it Richard Dad Path. So I think we can be pretty sure that that's where it happened. Now, if they could just put a little plaque alongside where it actually happened, that would be even more useful. Right, I do actually have a picture of Dad's hole, but it's just kind of, it's not the most useful because it's a picture of two trees in some brush in the middle of a field, so not useful. We've come back to this first set of trees that we found, and you know what, I'm going to choose to believe that this is Dad's hole and save myself from wandering around this field for the next however many hours. So now that we're here, what happened? Sometime after 7 a.m. the following day, a man called Mr. Leiter was driving his gig down Cobham Park Road on his way to the local market. He was a butcher and he was off to sell his goods. And he got some way down Cobham Park Road when he noticed what looked like a body about 40 yards off of the road. So he reined his horse and he climbed over a stile into the field where what looked like a corpse lay. And he noticed that the ground around the body was completely saturated with blood. So, before he did anything else, he saw a shepherd in a field about 200 yards away, who he called for help and asked whether he could watch over the corpse. And then he saw a boy who he sent back to the village to fetch the local constable. Then, Leiter himself went to the Ship Inn, because he'd noticed that the man on the floor was well dressed, so he made the correct assumption that he'd probably been staying at the inn, and wasn't just one of the poor locals. And of course, when he arrived there and he spoke to the waiter and described who it was he'd seen, the waiter, who'd already had his suspicions from the night before, immediately replied, "My God, that must be poor Mr. Dad." And so both of them made their way back to the scene of the crime, where the constable was already present. I'm going to add some more depth to this, so I'm going to use some of this pastel dust, really soften some of those edges, help blend. A lot of this is just about blending. I'm just going to use this just to add some detail to the canvas. Just something, you know? Now, at the scene of the crime, it looked like Dad had been attacked on the edge of Dad's hole, a deep hole surrounded by trees. At the time, it was known as Paddock Hole. There were signs of a scuffle around the body, scuff marks in the ground, blood obviously everywhere. And it looked like a good place for a murder. It was hidden from the main lane by a hedgerow, so nobody could see. And it was clear that this was not a robbery, because Dad still had all of his possessions with him. Nothing was gone. When it came to looking at the body, they found a severe bruise on the temple, as if he'd suffered a severe blow, and they found 2 gash wounds to the neck, although neither of those were fatal. The fatal wound was a stab wound to the chest. And lying near the body was a spring-bladed knife. And they did find a cutthroat razor beneath the body, but this didn't seem to have been used. Now, I've actually decided to walk over and investigate this other set of trees, because I think they actually more closely match the description of, big hole in the ground surrounded by trees. So we're going to have a last look over here, just in case. Well, it's definitely a hole, it's got water in it. Yep, I mean, this could very easily have been Dad's hole. And my sniffer dog is desperate to get in the water, which won't be happening. All right, yep, I'm gonna claim this as Dad's hole. Anyone even more local than me in the comments, feel free to correct me if you know where Dad's hole actually is. Yeah, I'm back. It was actually just over there. Well, there it is. Those 3 small trees in the middle of that field, which actually is where those people were digging, that is Dad's hole. Unfortunately, it's very much fenced off with a lot of barbed wire. I mean, there's a fence right here, and then there's a little fence around Dad's hole as well, because apparently it's, uneven ground and they don't want to risk people coming over and breaking an ankle going into it. So, what ultimately happened was probably something like this. They'd just gone on a little walk together. Robert had been having his doubts about the decision he'd made to begin with, and obviously Richard was probably feeling like he'd gotten away with one. And after mulling things over in the ship inn, Richard coming up from his walk and both of them heading off, they probably had a bit of a confrontation about it. Perhaps Robert actually changed his mind and decided to tell Richard that they were going back and he was going to be committed. Maybe not for a long time, but just long enough to get better. I mean, we all know that probably wouldn't have made him any better, but that's probably what happened. And I can't imagine that went down well with Richard. And Richard was probably right at the point of breaking at that stage anyway. And the fact that his dad probably seemed to be on the edge of actually committing him to an asylum is probably what pushed him over the edge. And so Richard probably found the closest thing to him, possibly a big rock or probably a log or something, and bashed his dad over the head with it. He then probably pulled out his cutthroat razor, and as we know, he had this obsession with cutting throats, and he probably started trying to do just that. And that's probably when Robert came round and started struggling with him, because obviously we know that he was unsuccessful, that the cuts to the throat were not the fatal wound. And so probably in that struggle, he couldn't really achieve anything, couldn't do what he was trying to. And so he switched to that knife and stabbed him in the heart. And we know from the autopsy report that he stabbed him into the heart and then partially pulled it back out again and kind of twisted it back in one more time. And that was the fatal wound. At which point, Richard probably realised what he'd done, and in a manic panic, fled back to the edge of the field over the stile, leaving that bloody handprint there, and made his way back to the ship inn, leaving his dad, Robert, for dead in this field we're stood in right now. Looking at it behind me in the field over there, that is no distance from Cobham at all. I mean, there's literally houses right there. Like, I know there weren't as many houses here when the murder took place, but it's still like, what, a few hundred yards away from the ship inn. That's as far as I made it before he snapped and killed his dad. I would say it is probably close enough to the ship inn that people would have heard screams. If he'd made screams, people would have heard them, which is why he probably took that blow to the head first. That dazed him, and he didn't have a chance to scream out for help. So it could have legitimately been from about where I'm standing right now that Mr. Leiter saw the body. And if we have a look from this perspective, there, that's Dad's hole. And I think
If you were stood here, walking past, and you glanced over, you can see how he spotted that body. It's not far at all. Where this public footpath sign is, this could very well have been where our style was that Dad escaped over, because it would have been where the public right-of-way is, and a lot of public rights-of-way in this country, in England, have been there for hundreds of years. And if that is where the footpath intersects the road, it's very likely that's where Richard Dad made his escape.
Now, the waiter quickly informed the constable that Robert Dad's son had last been seen with him, but nobody knew where he was. And at first, it was assumed that Richard Dad, being a wealthy artist, may have also been the victim of whoever this murderer was. No one in Cobham obviously knew of the psychological issues Richard Dad had been dealing with, and so him being a murderer was not the first thing that jumped to mind. But as soon as that information was found out, the search for another victim became a search for the murderer. Now, obviously this isn't the greatest reference to be working from, because it's a very old picture, so it gives us very little detail to actually work from. So this is ultimately going to end up just a kind of vague approximation of what we're looking at. Now, it turned out that Richard Dad had immediately gone back to the Ship Inn, collected the gig, and made it to London before the body was even discovered. And in London, he attended a public house called the Sol's Arms in Hampstead, which was apparently very popular with artists. And apparently the barmaid there said that the young gentleman had looked very wide-eyed and that something clearly wasn't right. And that upon overhearing people remarking this, Richard Dad had fled. I'm just going to get a bit more of that shadow in there, and then I'm probably going to go in with a rubber and just pick up edges, little highlights here or there, just to really gives it a little bit more dimension. See how it just adds a little bit of texture, a little bit of shape to the clothing here. Now, the next stop for Richard Dad was his bank, where he removed a large sum of money. Enough money, it appeared, to be able to flee the country. He then visited one of his friends in Oxford Street, and again was behaving very strangely. So when we're adding highlights like this, it's really about keeping it as subtle as possible. We don't want to just add white. We're just really adding an extra little bit of detail just to pick up certain elements. Like the beard, a little bit of highlight in the hair here. Just helps things pop a little. So, Richard Dad's friend also tried to inquire what he was planning on doing, why he looked distressed, why he'd taken out a bunch of money, and Richard Dad obviously then immediately left before answering any questions. But people weren't sure that his plan was to go abroad, and at some point there were even suggestions that he might have given up and thrown himself into the Thames. You'll note, throughout history in London, the Thames proved to be a very popular spot for people to give up everything and just do away with themselves. I mean, it literally happened a few weeks ago. Somebody murdered a girlfriend and threw himself into the Thames. So, while all this was going on, police were busy searching Richard's private rooms in Newman Street, and what they found was incredibly disturbing. They found huge quantities of eggs and ale, which was a very particular, bizarre diet that Richard had been on. But they also found sketches that appeared to be of Richard's friends and acquaintances, and every single one had a red cut drawn across their throat, just like Robert Dadd. Now, without having found Richard, he wasn't immediately confirmed as the murderer, but everyone had pretty much made up their mind, and the spot actually became something of a very brief tourist destination, with a lot of people coming to the scene of the murder to see what they could find, and finding a very disturbing scene where there was still evidence of the blood on the ground and bloody fingerprints on the stile which the murderer had crossed back over to escape. And in the meantime, Richard Dadd had made his way to France. And it was ultimately in France where he was finally captured. But not before one last piece of drama, where Richard Dadd was riding in a coach with a Frenchman and tried to slit his throat. Now, fortunately, he didn't succeed and he was captured, but it was clear that from his delusional ranting and raving that this man was not okay, and clearly had some obsession with throat slitting. Now, when he was arrested, he was searched, and he was found with a list of targets for his attack, including, amongst them, Franz Ferdinand, the Emperor of Austria, and his own dad, who was very much at the top of the list. And he was immediately committed to an asylum in France without a trial. And then there was a very strung out negotiation to get him back to England and actually have him stand trial. But ultimately, Richard was taken back to England, and it was decided he was unfit to face trial, and so he was immediately incarcerated in Broadmoor Hospital, where he stayed until 1863, at which point he was moved to the newly established Broadmoor Hospital for the criminally insane. And that is where he spent the rest of his days. But his story didn't quite end there. What I'm going to do here is just add a bit of texture to that background. And by doing that, we will help our subject just pop out a little more. It just gives the image a bit of depth and stops it from just being, basically a flat 2D image. While at Broadmoor, Richard Dadd was encouraged to keep painting. The doctors at both hospitals clearly recognised his incredible talent and decided, well, you're locked up in here for the rest of your life, so you might as well do something with it. And so it was actually post-incarceration that Richard Dadd produced some of his most famous work, including what some consider to be his most famous, the Fairy Fella's Masterstroke, which is a painting that actually inspired Freddie Mercury on the Queen II album. One of the tracks is literally titled The Fairy Fella's Masterstroke. And ultimately, after spending the rest of his life at Broadmoor, he died in 1886, aged 69, still incarcerated in Broadmoor Hospital. And ever since then, historians and art critics alike, or art historians, have looked at his work and tried to see the parallels between his fantastical, magical works and the clear mental health problems, the clear what we'd see now as probably paranoid schizophrenia. And how did that impact his art? And people for a long time have been studying it with a fascination for what is that connection between creativity and mental health, which gets us into a whole debate about, art versus the artist. Can you have somebody who is clearly not mentally well, but without that thing that we have decided is wrong with them, they possibly would never have created the art that they are remembered for? And there are a lot of, obviously, more modern examples of that. So ultimately, Richard Dadd is one of the first examples we have of an incredible artist with some unbelievably imaginative, magical artwork, but with a real murderous darkness behind it all. So that's something uplifting to think about. Can we have incredible art without being in some way mentally broken? Hopefully, it'd be nice. Anyway, here we go. That's all right. I'm my own worst critic. I'm never happy with anything I've ever made. So sometimes I just have to sit back and be like, you know what, that's fine. That'll do. So Here's Richard.
And I almost forgot to add some fairies.
I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, remember to like and subscribe. That really helps me make more of these, and I'll see you in the next one.